Okay, so this is kind of going to be our goal for this week. It's a composition involving, it's essentially a forest composition, okay? And so it's going to involve trees and leaves and foliage and shrubs, a sense of space. It's going to challenge us in our overall design understandings, okay? I think I'm going to be able to get through this week's lessons I think I'm going to be able to do it in three half-hour lessons, okay? Okay, so the first thing that I want to talk about is the shape of a tree trunk, okay? And I'm going to start with a cylinder. And in some ways, that's a reasonable tree trunk. I think it has a lot to do with a lot of tree trunks. The first thing that's good about it is that it's a cylinder. It's got this and it's got that, okay? And that shows us that it's round. And we might like it a little bit better if we made it so that the top part of the cylinder was over our eye level and the bottom part is underneath our eye level, okay? That kind of makes it a little bit better at first. Let's see what other things we can think of to make this more convincing. Another thing that's a kind of a nice thing to do is to allow the tree trunk to be big at the bottom and smaller as it moves its way up. And that kind of has something to do with the way things grow. Things tend to be bigger at the bottom and smaller at the top. Okay. Now, our tree trunk right now is a little bit like this. It's almost like if we drew a person and drew them like this. Nothing's really wrong with this person. It's a little bit kind of boring, right? This one little improvement from this gesture to this gesture was introduced by Polykleitos, and Michelangelo made use of this gesture in his statue of David, which is one of the crowning achievements of the Renaissance. And it's called Contrapposto, or Counterpoint. And what you have is you end up with a passive side and an active side. And it has a really nice feeling in terms of design. It feels good. So let's see if we can take this tree trunk, and what I'd like to encourage you to do is to draw a line, like it will be a line down the center of the tree. And I'd like to encourage you to search for or try to let the tree trunk have some movement or an active and passive side, and that would be one way of doing it. Here I've given us one way. Here we could make it more active. We could try to make it more active still. And I find that tree trunks are kind of fun in, like, look at this. You can go like this. Imagine it as a person. So here's a person, a tree trunk that's a person. And here's another one. Kind of anthropomorphizing, okay? Now here's another actually design concept from ancient Greece. If you have a pillar in, like, the Parthenon, before you reach the ceiling, there's a sort of spreading out. And the same thing happens before you reach the ground. There's a kind of a widening. And kind of what's happening here is there's a transition from this plane to this plane that's softened by those sorts of marks. And it's from this plane to this plane, and it's softened. It's like a negotiation. You're like, I've got to go this way, and I got to go this way, and so I'm going to cut this corner like that. And you'll notice that in all things tree, that's another possibility. So as we make our way up the trunk, and we get to the beginning of the canopy, the leaf canopy, the branches head outwards like this. And as we get towards the ground, the roots make their way outward like this. Here's a thing that's nice to do also. When you get to the canopy of the branches, if you have them leave the trunk at exactly the same moment, that's one possibility, but another possibility is to alter the moment that they're going to leave. So I'm going to sketch the sides of my trees, and now I'm reaching the point at which I want to start to move outwards into the branches. And this time, it feels very natural to move outwards into the branches like this, here. And because of that, I'm going to come lower on the other side, so that the height is not exactly the same. Now here I'm ending up with the height reading as exactly the same, and so I'm going to drop the right side and raise the left, so that I'm continuing to build an asymmetry. As the branches develop, they have a tendency to do this. They have a tendency to, starting from here, they have a tendency, this is longer. Whatever comes next, this segment will be longer. The next segment will be slightly shorter, and the next segment, again, a tiny bit shorter, and a tiny bit shorter, a tiny bit shorter, a tiny bit shorter, a tiny bit shorter. And as we move down the tree, these segments also have a tendency to thin. And this is going to go out to nothing, okay? any of these knuckles are a good spot to introduce another movement in the branch. Another thing that's possible with the branches, you see this branch is being looked at in side view, but it's also possible that the branch is looked at more directly. So for instance, if we have a cylinder and we're seeing the cylinder in side view, that's how it reads. But this little set of cylinders can also be moved into front view. Like we can also be looking at it with foreshortening, and that would look like this. I'm overlapping the back and the front. There's an overlap. Here I'm going to overlap. And here I'm going to overlap again. And this becomes this, but looked at in front view. So this one I've taken and mounted on the side of the trunk, right? This right here is on the side of the trunk. I'm also free to put a branch on this part of the trunk. And this can go a long ways in terms of making your tree look dimensional. And for some reason, we don't think to do it too often. And another place that a branch can be added is from behind. So if I go like this, and notice this line right here. That line really sets this branch back. And every segment of the tree has the opportunity to turn. And I'm really partial to these branches. These branches feel to me like, so another way to develop a branch, like all the branches that we're developing so far have been, they have a kind of robotic feeling. But if you're interested in developing a branch that feels more organic, and some of the lines of branches are really truly beautiful, you're always free to take a branch and make a line and just look inside of a line. Like you can just take a gestural line and stretch it outwards and see where it wants to go, see how it interacts with the design, and then from there start to make some decisions. Like let's say that will become this line for the branch. It will become the activating line for the branch. And now I'm going to start to search for how this branch will become more volumes. So right now it's just kind of a line, but how am I going to go from this line to something that's and that can feel a lot more organic. The trunk has lighting. The trunk is subject to being to light and shade in a couple of different ways. One of the things to keep in mind in general is that trees are just a little bit on the dark side. You know, they're kind of, unless it's a birch tree, they're kind of a dark medium value, right? Another thing to keep in mind is that a cylinder, if you learn how to shade a cylinder, it really teaches you how to think about the shading of a tree. Like, let's say, for instance, our light source is over here. In the shading of a cylinder, you have the core shadow, halftone, halftone again, so that's the core shadow. This lightness over here is the reflected light, okay? And this is how we shade a cylinder, essentially. Now, we can take that same principle and apply it to a tree trunk. So if we take a tree trunk, like, for instance, this one, and we throw our light on it in that direction, and we can say, okay, everything from this side of that form is going to start to fall into shadow, and everything from this side of that form, and now this side of that form, okay, towards directly at the spot where the shadow edge begins, it's darker. That's our core shadow. This is our reflected light. And because the tree is kind of cylindrical, the transition from core shadow to light is very gentle. I'm kind of darkening down the reflected light. Okay, so this is how we start to work on the shading of a tree trunk. Now, the next thing that I want to talk about is how we would start to suggest the texture of a tree trunk. And you can use the texture of a tree trunk to do your shading work, but there's a couple of different patterns that work really nicely. So, for instance, one really nice pattern is this. Starting from the position of my core shadow, long marks. And a darker concentration of them at the core shadow. And then I take the long marks and stretch them. And I'm lightening up these marks. But as I get to the position of the core shadow, I'm really letting them darken in. Okay, so that's just marks like this. And then I make them sometimes more dense, and this it works nicely with ink or anything, and then I just let them space out a little bit. And in the light, you might have some detail. It's probably not going to be just light. Okay, so that is a nice kind of texture for a tree trunk. Here's another nice texture. Another thing that's a really good idea to do with trees is to have the outside texture, like the right here, to have that be rougher, because you try to imagine that it's tree bark, and tree bark is really kind of rough. And so here's another good one. You can use lines that kind of wrap. And sometimes you'll see trees like this. And here I'm going to densify at the core shadow. And that's just wrapping lines. And there are things I really like about this one. Here's another one. How about like cherry trees? Like you can take marks like this. Essentially any kind of mark that suggests tree bark to you. Okay. Here's the kind of last one I think I'll talk about. I saw this one, it's really good. It's like stacking coins. Like a little stack of coins like that. And you could take a tree trunk and imagine it as having these stacks of coins around it. Oh. But, okay. Being a little overly regular. That's it. I'm being a little overly regular. And now I would want to shade this. I would say the light is coming from this direction. And I would shade in here. And I would say that the light would be hiding from that side, so we'd see this little bit of light there. There's my core shadow. And here's a little reflected light, and this over here would all be in shadow and reflected light. And I kind of think that's everything I know about tree trunks right now.